3 astronauts bound for the Heavenly Palace.
有
That's China's space station still under construction. From a launch pad in the Gobi Desert, the rocket ship dubbed the Divine Vessel blasting off.
On the 17th June 2021, after years of careful planning and executing, the Chinese National Space Agency sent 3 astronauts to their Tiangong space station, starting a new page in their space exploration effort. In the background on the same day, a Falcon 9 rocket carrying a national security mission was also successfully completed. This juxtaposition of 2 superpowers' space missions was all kind of familiar. The same thing used to happen frequently in the 60s, which ended badly with one superpower's collapse. So is there going to be another space race? Before we start, I'd like to introduce to you my newsletter, Disrupted. It was launched only 2 weeks ago, and we are already a community of over 250,000 people. What a journey. If you like business analysis and are curious about how our world operates, be sure to subscribe to the newsletter in the link down below. I have an extended section of this video focused on answering what China wants and why when it comes to space. I think you like it. Only available on Disrupted. I'll see you there. I'm gonna put forward my proposition right now. Yes, I think the new space race may have already begun. We just didn't realize it. The strategic interests of both superpowers are so different this time that the new space race is not going to be about who gets to the moon first. This time, the space race is going to happen on Earth. But how did we get here? The Economist has a great illustration of all space launches since the 1950s, and if you look closely, China was not even in the picture at the beginning. It was largely dominated by state-affiliated launch providers from the United States and the Soviet Union. Over 140 space launches were performed every year in the 60s, higher than even what we have today. The first successful Chinese orbit launch was in 1970, and they were caught up in domestic political struggles. For the uninitiated out there, the Chinese were busy fighting the Cultural Revolution then. They have little time for this, and indeed, their launch frequency shows. Meanwhile, on the main battleground of space race, the United States were winning. It turns out the Soviet Union wasn't as powerful as they claimed to be, and the US got to the moon first. But as the US realized that what matters to the Cold War was to deliver a better life for her people and shifted more resources from space, Soviet Union doubled down with more launches. In the end, the US won. But if that is the case, shouldn't China be lagging behind the United States in space development? Well, indeed they are. The Chinese only established CNSA, their equivalent of NASA, in April 1993 and started building their space systems from scratch. Meanwhile, the United States was on a whole different level, performing essentially reusable trips from ISS using the space shuttle. On top of that, being much further ahead, the United States employed a different strategy. It gradually privatized the industry. During this period, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and then SpaceX took over the launches. The state providers phased out. In Europe, Arianespace also became a powerful private contender. On the other side of the Pacific, the Chinese might have started late. It also had its superpower, state planning. Here is a newspaper that went viral on Chinese media last year. It was dated in 2005. It spelled out China's plan to retrieve moon samples by 2020, and it was juxtaposed against Japan's plan for a moon base in 2025 and the US plan to have boots back on the moon no later than 2020. The US goal has now shifted to 2024, and unless Japan can pull a rocket out of its head, 2025 for the moon base is hardly achievable. But you know who did it on time? The Chinese. They've landed on the far side of the moon and retrieved samples in 2020. That gave them a lot of credibility. Now with their newly built space station Tiangong occupied by astronauts, their plan is to build a moon base by 2030 and man on Mars by 2050. Their rising trend line cannot be ignored. This is the strategic power shift that got us to where we are today. The Chinese accession and the US relative decline in the states sector. Of course, the US private sector is booming and potentially the biggest competitor for China In many ways, the US is doing a lot better, but a clash is about to happen. It's important to understand that the space race between the United States and Soviet Union was never about space. It was about economy and winning people's minds and hearts. It was abundantly clear to the United States once it got to the moon in 1969. The US launch number declined sharply afterwards because they know what people really wanted was a big house with lovely families and perhaps Coca-Cola and Hollywood movies.
Did you say hospitality? That's one thing we're always prepared for around here. Help yourself.
In 2011, the United States Congress singled out China in the Wolf Amendment and banned NASA from cooperating with China, citing national security concerns. So the Chinese had to go it alone, which got us to where we are today. You see, the whole reason why China and the United States are having this geopolitical tension is not because of China's rising space capability. If space capability is what matters, Russia is still more powerful, and there is no Cold War rhetoric against Russia. It was the fact that China is now a formidable economic competitor. It has delivered for its people in the past 40 years, increasing its GDP per capita from around $800 in 1999 to just over $10,000 today in PPP terms. It was the fact that the Chinese is now making 5G technologies better than everyone else. Space race represented the peak of technology in the 60s. Competition in space was about the future, about who gets to build the most sophisticated machines. The US responded at the time with Saturn V, and it was a complete success. But in the 21st century, space technology no longer represents the full picture. We gotta admit that. In addition to space, the contest is also about who gets to dominate the microspace, the best semiconductors. There's also 5G technology, high-speed rails, artificial intelligence, big data, and other industrial applications. There is also the financial services sector, which is now much bigger than manufacturing. And here, the competition will be about currency and, of course, the Chinese new digital yuan. The competition is getting very broad and very complex. But space is one of the fundamental components still. One of the critical tech is communication satellite networks. This is, of course, a vertical that SpaceX is in, and it is important for 5G deployment in the consumer sector and many industrial sectors, such as precision manufacturing and remote mining operations. These require low-latency communication networks that only LEO satellites can provide. Imagine the possibility of managing a mining drill remotely from the comfort of a control center. Not only will this increase efficiency, it will also make the job safer. As of today, the Chinese have just started building the space station. There are many more modules to go, and the two superpowers have come to a crossroad. They have an important decision to make, whether to cooperate or to compete. If you ask me, I think the space is big enough for both of them.